morning is not easy. And it is not simple. And it took a lot of prayer for me to be able to stand up here this morning and speak my truth on such a controversial subject. So before I can talk about abortion, before I can talk about reproductive rights, you need to know a little bit about me and my relationship to this issue. You see, I have had only a single very intentional pregnancy, because I can't really get pregnant on accident. Well, there's that. And I've never had an abortion, however. According to the Guttmacher Institute, 1 in 3 women will have had an abortion by the age of 45. 1 in 3 women, and I am not yet 45. Not 1 in 3 non-church-going women, not 1 in 3 atheist women, not 1 in 3 uneducated women, 1 in 3 women, in spite of their educational background or their ethnicity or their immigration status or their financial situation, 1 in 3 women. And I have walked with many of you who have also walked with some of those women at the clinic here in town, because the majority of those volunteers come from All Souls. Some of you in the line told me about your experiences from the last service, some of the folks who came through, and one particular volunteer said that she volunteered when she was 7 months pregnant, which I just thought was insanely powerful. But I want to tell you about some of the women that I met there at the clinic. And I have blended some stories so that I will not be revealing any one particular identity, but I believe it's important for you to know some of the faces of these Oklahoma women who are not monsters, who are not using abortion as birth control. They are women in difficult situations, difficult circumstances, who are praying to God to make the right decision for them, praying to God that they will make the right decision for their family and for that potential life. Now, 6 years ago, when I first volunteered for Peaceful Presence, I was new here at All Souls, and I met Mary. Peaceful Presence is a group of men and women who organize to escort the women who come to the clinic from their cars to the front door and to help them check in. Now, these volunteers are part of the Oklahoma Religious Coalition for Reproductive Choice, the group that Kelly spoke of, an organization that began in this church and about which you heard the current chair, Kelly Jennings, speak earlier. Now, there's also an essay, for those of you who are curious, written by Carol Joyce, who's a member of our church, on the role of our church in the history of reproductive rights, in a book by her husband, also a member, that you can find in Oklahoma I'd Never Seen Before, Alternative Views of Oklahoma History. I know that they're ordering some more copies for the book table. So I was a new minister in town, and I was drawn to volunteer for Peaceful Presence through a conversation with another member of our church, Sue Ames. Now, Sue couldn't be here today, but I want you to know that Sue Ames has tirelessly carried out the work of taking on the fight for reproductive rights in Tulsa for over 30 years. Yes, she has. She has worked at the clinic and recently retired from that position this year, although she continues to do work for OKRCRC. It was Sue's calm clarity of the importance of this work that moved me to stand with the women who were going to the clinic, regardless of my own struggle and personal opinion about abortion. It was Sue who made it very clear to me that these women needed a voice. So let me take you back to Mary, that woman that I met at Reproductive Services. It was a Friday morning, and I was volunteering to check women into the clinic. I was dressed in normal clothes, so no one would have guessed that I was a minister unless I'd had an extended conversation with them. They usually think I'm a social worker or a teacher or something. And frankly, I wasn't planning on telling anyone, simply because at the time, I was afraid that it would make them uncomfortable because of who they thought I represented. Now, Mary was in her late 30s. She had long, straight, blonde hair and was dressed in a long denim skirt and an oversized sweater. She was uncomfortable, fidgety. She paused occasionally while talking to me to wring her hands back and forth and stare up at the ceiling. After helping her fill out her personal information on the forms, she turned and looked at me square in the eye for what was the first time and pointedly said, "Why are you helping me?" And I said, "Because I believe people who need help should be treated with dignity. And I know I can do that." She then told me that her husband didn't know that she was at the clinic, and that she had 5 other children who were with her sister that morning and who believed that she was at a doctor's appointment of another sort. She felt she was all alone and she couldn't tell anyone. She said that she'd been married for 6 years and had 5 children in those 6 years. She said she couldn't do it again. They were struggling to support the family as it was. She wasn't able to work because she had to care for those kids. And her husband, just the week before, had been laid off. He was a shift worker, so none of them had any insurance, even before he was laid off. And she was afraid that they were going to lose their home. She told me that her husband didn't believe in birth control. He believed that pregnancy was God's will and should be left up to God. But each of her pregnancies had been more and more difficult for her. She was even bedridden for the last 4 months with her youngest, and it took a toll on her other children and her relationship with her sister. Now this time, as soon as she stopped breastfeeding, she secretly went to Planned Parenthood and got on the pill. She was afraid if her husband found out about the contraception, he would leave her. And even though he had never physically hit her, she was frightened that if he found out, he might hurt her or her children. So she couldn't imagine him learning about the pregnancy or the abortion. She came to the clinic as soon as she knew she was pregnant. She didn't know what else to do. But what she did know was that she couldn't have another child. She knew a pregnancy would seriously harm her physically and leave her temporarily, if not permanently, incapable of caring for her other children. She knew that they couldn't afford another pregnancy, another birth, or another child. And she believed that God didn't want her to be trapped like this. Now, I believe that it is no coincidence that another statistic of secrets that I have preached from this very pulpit happens to be 1 in 3 women. In my sermon, "Why Have You Forsaken Me?" I spoke very specifically about another issue among women that we don't like to discuss, and that is that 1 in 3 American women between the ages of 18 and 65 has experienced domestic violence, in spite of their educational background, or ethnicity, or immigration status, or financial situation. 1 in 3. When I told Mary at the end of our conversation that I was a minister, she immediately began to weep. She said God must have brought me there that day to let her know that it was going to be okay. And she asked me if she was going to hell. There are so many women that I could describe to you this morning. Black and white, Asian, Hispanic, Indian. I cannot describe them all to you. So just close your eyes for a minute and imagine all those women you know and love between the ages of 12, yes, Kelly and I both said 12, and 55. This issue knows no educational, ethnic, or class boundaries. 1 in 3 women. Nearly half of the pregnancies in American women are considered unintended, and 4 in 10 of those end in abortion. And every woman is different, and every circumstance is complex. My colleague, Reverend Erica Barone, wrote, "This issue is about real women with unexpected, unplanned, physically dangerous, or violently begun pregnancies. trying to make decisions about how to move forward. It is about real partners and real families of these women trying to support them and trying to deal with their own complicated emotions. It's about real women who may feel coerced into having abortions by parents or economic circumstances. It's about real women who may be prevented from having an abortion by parents or partners or economic circumstances. For some, this decision will haunt them for the rest of their lives. I have worked with women who mark the would-have-been birthday and reflect yearly on the child that could have been regularly. And I know other women whose decision was so clear to them that they were able to make this decision so early that they do not find it necessary or even appropriate to conceive of a child's life having been lost. Because it is so controversial, because it is so shamed in our culture, we don't talk about it. And the way to fight shame, I believe, is head on. The way to fight shame is to find a way to talk about it. So if you've had an abortion, no matter how long ago, no matter whether you are someone who was clear or conflicted in your choice, if you haven't told anyone, I ask that you find a confidant and come out about it. No one would guess 1 in 3 women. And so telling our story will take the power away from this secret by allowing America to begin to see that the faces of those having abortions are our sisters and our daughters and our mothers and our aunts and our grandmothers and our friends. Now, I had the opportunity to talk with the staff at Reproductive Services, our city's only clinic where a woman can have an abortion. They are overworked and ridiculously underpaid. It is a stressful job, both because of the physical and mental demands, but also because of the emotional demands of being present for these women during their difficult time. Most of the staff whom I met work there because they feel called to do this work. One staff person who opened up to me said that she'd been a client some 10 years before, and that the women she came to seek services on the staff treated her with such dignity and such respect during what was one of the most difficult decisions in her life. After her abortion, she went on to complete nursing school and start a family, and when a position opened up at the clinic, she knew that she needed to take it because she felt there were so few people in our state, she believed, who could take that job and be able to treat the patients with respect. So when she took it, some of her family turned against her. When she took it, she stopped going to church because of the message that was being preached there. Even though she knew in every aspect of her being that this indeed was her calling. I've spoken with the doctors who choose to put their careers and their lives at risk in order to support the clinic. Both of the doctors told me that they do it because they know it's needed and they believed that they were capable of doing it in this climate, even though the risk of their support of these women could in fact cost them their lives. Both doctors happened to be married and confided in me that their spouses were supportive, but that they stayed scared. The staff and the medical support at Reproductive Services have to deal with bomb threats and verbal abuse weekly. I went with many of you, actually, to a memorial service in our community for the doctor in Kansas City, Dr. George Tiller, who was killed just 3 years ago this spring, while in his own church, serving as an usher during a Sunday morning service. He was shot, murdered by a man who believed that Dr. Tiller was murdering children and not saving lives. As Reverend Dr. Ragsdale said, our faith cannot answer the question of when a fetus becomes a person. We also know that the whole question of fetal personhood is a disingenuous and often malicious attempt to distract us from the real issue, which is that women also are people. She's a person endowed by God, the U.S. Constitution, and common sense and decency with rights and responsibilities that she must exercise to the best of her ability using her own best judgment. And I will not stand quietly and watch while religious people oversimplify this issue. I will not stand quietly while the loudest religious voice in our country claims to know whose side God is on. I will not stand quietly by. And so this year, when Oklahoma landed on Jon Stewart yet again for our embarrassing politics, this time over the personhood bill, I chose to volunteer at Peaceful Presence again. Now let me just pause here to say, because I believe it's important, that Senator Crane, who authored the personhood bill in Oklahoma, has a Republican challenger this election. So if you are so registered, you might pay attention to that election. And whoever wins that primary will in fact be running against Julie Hall, who happens to be a member of our church. So this will be an interesting race, an interesting time here in Oklahoma. This congregation is out to make a difference. And in my 6 years here at All Souls, it has made a difference in me as a minister, and for the better, I do believe. So this year, when I stepped up to stand with Peaceful Presence, I chose to wear a clerical collar. Now let me paint you a picture of what you might see if you were to volunteer, and should you choose to do so, and I hope you will. Kelly and OKRCRC have a table in Emerson Hall, and they'd love to talk to you about it. But when you turn down the street of the clinic off the main road, it's actually difficult to see the driveway entrance to the clinic because the protesters are actually stationed on both sides of the street. A Catholic group has purchased the land directly across the street from the clinic, and they use that space to put enormous signs on advocating their position. There are 4-foot-tall signs with graphic images, and usually a row of young people praying their rosary. Rumor has it that students from a local Catholic school actually receive extra credit for showing up, and they do all seem to file out just in time to make it to first class. This particularly infuriated me. The protesters and their placards and signs are allowed to be on the same side of the street as the clinic because there is a sidewalk there. So when I showed up, I thought, my tax dollars are paying for you to stand on that sidewalk, and I don't care for that. Went directly to the police officer who's parked in the parking lot, and he told me that they actually do have a right to be on that public sidewalk. So that police officer in the parking lot is actually to provide safety for the clinic and the patients, but I have to say it ramps up the feeling when you pull in. So the patients have to drive between protesters trying to locate the entrance, between signs, while the protesters are shouting at all the cars coming in. They are effective at frightening the women, but they are not effective in changing their minds. And so I question the purpose. So anyway, when you arrive and you're pointed by a Peaceful Presence volunteer wearing a purple or orange vest and likely a member of our church, as a volunteer, you would park your car, sign in at the office, receive a vest, and then stand in the parking lot pointing cars where to park and greeting the women as they get out of their cars, then walking with them to the front door, offering them just a kind, compassionate face as the protesters continue to shout at them until they get inside. When I arrived to volunteer about 4 months ago, I was in my clerical collar this time. I was clear that I was coming to be a religious representation to the clinic side of the street. The volunteers of OKRCRC do not actively promote any church or religion, nor do I think they should, but I can. And so when I got out of the car that Friday, it was like I'd poked a bee's nest. I stood near the driveway entrance where the protesters had placed a CD player bearing Christian music, which I happened to know. And so I stood near it and sang quietly while they continued to shout. After about 20 minutes of shouting from afar while I stood singing to their music, one of the protesters came near the CD player and began to pray for me very loudly. As I stood quietly, he yelled, praying for my misdirection, praying for my false prophethood, praying for my broken soul. When he was finished, I realized not only how important my presence was for the women, but also for the big picture, for God, for my theology. Yes. And so I wanted those protesters to know that God was not that small, not limited to one side of this issue. And so after the prayer, I went to each of the volunteers and asked if we could pray together before we left, after the appointments were all checked in so that the women were already in the building. And they all agreed. So we circled up near the driveway, and I prayed a prayer, much quieter, I might add, thanking God for an opportunity to serve, offering strength to the women during their difficult decision, praying for the volunteers of Peaceful Presence for their willingness to see God in the midst of such controversy and crisis, and to stand in God's shoes, offering compassion in the midst of it. The protesters were stunned into silence. Now, I knew in that moment that I was called to go to each of them and shake their hand. And so I went from one to the next, looking them in each in the eye, and I heard myself say the first time, "God is bigger than all of this. Bless you." Which I repeated then after calmly to everyone. God is bigger than all of this. Bless you. They were all willing to shake my hand. I was able to tell that the impact on some was significant, and others, though, were cruel in their responses to me, saying that I was blasphemous, that I shouldn't represent the clergy, that I should take that collar off now and leave it with them. I had another ask me if I was willing to repent with them right then and there on my knees. I held my poise and my ground, and I breathed. God is bigger than all of this, and I turned the other cheek. When I drove away, I broke down in my car and sobbed. I cried for the women who were in this situation in the first place, for the well-intended people on both sides of this issue, and for the painful questioning of my intentions, of my call, of my relationship to God. I had been easily dismissed by some of those protesters, first just because I was a woman in a collar, which, not to mention that I was a gay woman in a collar, which they probably didn't even know. And then I was dismissed for being a Unitarian in a collar, so that was 3 strikes, really. So certainly you all know me, though, well enough to know that I don't do being dismissed very well. And I knew, though, that I had made a difference that day. I felt it more strongly than I often do, even in my daily work, and I knew I needed to speak about this particular issue. So I came back to church, and I told our other ministers on staff about my experience, and I asked if they would be willing to show up on a Friday as well. And by the end of the day, I had scheduled a setup so that for the next 16 weeks, a different minister, white, black, women, men, older, younger, would show up consistently in a collar to bring God to that side of the street and to show the other side of the street that it was not just a single, questionable female minister in a collar. They are on a rotation, and I will keep it going as long as I have clergy to help. It is an army of liberally religious clergy who will not be polarized, who will not oversimplify, and who I encourage to cross the street and shake hands with the other side when they volunteer, to make sure that they know that we are, in fact, standing in God's shoes, thank you very much, above the politics and above the polarization. And so my call to you this morning is to rise above the oversimplification of this issue. We are not pro-life, and we are not pro-choice. Those women making difficult decisions to have an abortion are thinking about life. They are thinking about their life, the lives of their families, and the potential life that is within them. Pro-choice people are not making some flip choice. Pro-choice people do not celebrate abortion. They are grateful for the incredible gift of life and want to treat it with value and reverence. So much so that they don't want anyone else to tell them what to do with anyone else's life. Pro-choice is not some haphazard choice, it is a complex decision. And even though I hope I will never have to have an abortion, I can imagine circumstances that might cause me to have to make that decision. And even though I do not ever want my daughter Beckett to have an abortion, I can imagine circumstances where that may in fact be the most painful but maybe the best decision that she could possibly make. And it seems to me that if we want the least amount of abortions possible, which I in fact do, then we all, pro-choice and pro-life, Democrat and Republican, need to be working to legalize abortion, because statistics show that in countries where abortion is banned, the number of abortions actually increases. And it just so happens that in most countries where abortion is illegal, there is also a ban on contraception. So women are forced to sacrifice their own bodies. It's this third world mentality. Wait, no, it's Oklahoma. And so we live in a state that Jon Stewart makes fun of. And we live in a state where sexual education focuses on just saying no. When no is not enough. And at the least, if you really want to lower the rates of abortion, it seems that we might want to make contraception more available, that we might be able to fund it, that we might talk about it, that we might teach our children about it. As Reverend Dr. Ragsdale said so eloquently, we're for reproductive rights because we know that the Bible and any faith worthy of the name do not give simple and easy answers to complex and difficult questions. They don't promise to spare us from making tough decisions. They just promise us that we won't have to face those decisions and those choices alone. And while our various religious traditions may teach various things about when and if and how we should sacrifice ourselves for others, not one, no one, not partner or priest or politician, no one gets to decide what is or is not an appropriate sacrifice for someone else to make. No one. Now, the good news is that this issue is being fought all across the country at the state level, which means that you have the power to make a difference in how you vote, in how you show up, in the editorials you write, in your refusal to let this issue be oversimplified, in your support for comprehensive sex ed in our public schools, and for funding contraception and making it available so that women can make more informed decisions about prevention. And no matter what your personal decision would be about abortion, stand up for your daughter, your sister, your mother, your girlfriend, your wife, your friend, 1 in 3, so that no one forces a decision on someone whom you love. Stand up because you're a religious person, and God is bigger than all of this. Bless you. Amen.